The corporate world has a funny way of measuring value. To the executives sitting in high offices, a piece of paper from an elite school is worth more than decades of keeping a dangerous facility running safely. I was reminded of this painful truth when the human resources representative pushed the document across the cheap laminate table. She had a cold, practiced expression, the kind designed to discourage any negotiation. She told me that the 31-year-old MBA graduate from Harvard who had just finished his internship was worth 75% more than me. I had spent 15 years at Vertex Manufacturing and 28 years in total keeping complex chemical systems safe. The offer letter in front of me was a joke. It stated that my compensation was being adjusted to align with internal equity guidelines. In reality, it was a polite way of telling me that I was being underpaid so they could fund the massive salaries of the young corporate trainees. The woman across from me was Lydia Bennett. She did not look me in the eye. Instead, she kept her focus on her digital tablet, ticking off checklist boxes as if my life and career were just admin tasks. Lydia Bennett was notorious for being a corporate mouthpiece who never questioned orders from above. She carried herself with an air of superiority, as if her human resources credentials made her an expert in the actual work being done in the facility. I did not yell. I did not complain about the times I had saved this company millions of dollars or the countless weekend emergencies I had resolved. I simply reached into my folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was my resignation letter, signed and dated. I slid it across the table with a calm smile. I told her my resignation was effective at 11:15 in the morning. By 11:18, my security badge was deactivated. By 11:24, my network access was cut. But by 11:55, the assistant to the chief executive officer was running through the gravel parking lot, screaming my name. Let me explain how a quiet engineer became the most expensive lesson in this company's history. My name is Harvey Thorne. At the plant, most people called me Harv. I am 58 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life working on control systems. I did not go to a prestigious university. I got my engineering degree from a modest state school. Before that, I spent 9 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, working on water treatment plants and floodgates. That was where I learned that a single mistake in process control could destroy an entire community. When I joined Vertex Manufacturing 15 years ago, it was still a family-owned business run by people who understood production. The control systems were old, dating back to the late 20th century, but they worked because a few experienced operators understood their quirks. I made myself indispensable by taking on the night shifts and troubleshooting the issues that terrified the younger staff. Over the years, my role grew, but human resources always managed to keep my formal title just below the level that would trigger a real salary adjustment. I did not mind too much because I loved the work and believed in our team. Everything changed when Vertex was purchased by Vanguard Industrial Group, a private equity firm focused on cutting costs. They brought in a new chief executive officer, Julian Drake, who was obsessed with digital transformation. Julian did not understand chemical engineering, but he loved charts and presentations. He launched a leadership program for business graduates. That was how we got Bradley Croft, a young man who had never worn steel-toed boots in his life, but had a degree from Harvard. Within 9 months, Bradley was named Director of Manufacturing Excellence. He had the power to make decisions about safety systems he could not even explain. Bradley loved to talk about optimization, but he had never stood in the control room at 2 in the morning when a reactor began to overheat. The real insult came when Bradley posted an internal analysis of engineering salaries. He claimed the data was anonymous, but since I was the only senior control engineer with 15 years of experience, it was obvious which line was mine. My compensation was barely higher than the starting salary of the trainees. Bradley was earning 75% more than me to make slides about systems I had built. I began keeping detailed records of every safety warning I sent that was ignored and every process shortcut Bradley attempted to implement. The final straw came during my annual review. My wife, Sarah, and I were looking at universities for our daughter, Emily, who wanted to study engineering. The tuition was $85,000 a year, and we still had 16 years left on our mortgage. On top of that, Sarah needed good health insurance to cover her diabetes medication. When Lydia Bennett told me my raise was only 2.5%, while inflation was over 6%, I knew I was done. She told me that Bradley Croft had a different educational background that commanded a market premium. I did not argue. I just signed my resignation and walked out. I knew they did not understand what they were losing. You can write down how a system works, but you cannot write down the instinct that tells you when a valve is about to fail. As I packed my personal things into the back of my truck, I stood in the parking lot and looked back at the sprawling industrial facility. Over my 15 years at Vertex Manufacturing, I had watched this place transform from a proud, safety-conscious plant into a playground for financial analysts. In the early years, the company was managed by old-school chemical engineers who understood the extreme dangers of high-pressure chemical manufacturing. They knew that a single misaligned control loop or a faulty pressure sensor could cause a catastrophic chemical release, endangering the lives of hundreds of workers. I had built my career on preventing those exact disasters, drawing on my 9 years of active duty in the Army Corps of Engineers. In the Army, I had worked on massive water control systems and water filtration plants, where a single failure would flood entire valley towns or contaminate drinking water for thousands of citizens. That experience taught me to respect the equipment and to never take shortcuts. We used to have weekly safety meetings where operators could voice their concerns directly to management, and their feedback was actually implemented. When Vanguard Industrial Group bought the facility, all of that changed. They immediately replaced the plant manager with a corporate administrator who had never set foot in a chemical plant. This administrator brought in a team of junior consultants who wore clean corporate attire and carried tablets, looking completely out of place on our oil-stained concrete floors. They spent their days timing operators with stopwatches and telling us that our safety protocols were inefficient. The team of consultants seemed more interested in finding faults and justifying their own presence than in actually learning the nuances of chemical manufacturing. They ignored the operators' decades of experience and treated us like automated parts of a machine. I remember attempting to explain the complex startup sequence of the distillation columns to one of these trainees, only for him to interrupt me and ask if we could shorten the heat-up cycle to save utility costs. I told him that doing so would thermal shock the vessel and crack the internal trays, but he just wrote something in his notebook and walked away. One of my proudest moments at Vertex occurred during the Thanksgiving holiday weekend of 2017. It was a freezing Saturday night, and the plant was operating with a skeleton crew. Suddenly, the main reactor began showing erratic temperature readings, spiking dangerously. The vessel contained a specialized polymer batch worth $1,100,000, which was critical for an aerospace defense contract. If the temperature fluctuated by more than 2 degrees, the entire batch would solidify into a solid mass of worthless resin, destroying the multi-million-dollar reactor vessel and shutting down the facility for months. The plant manager called me in a panic, and I immediately drove to the plant. I spent 72 continuous hours in the control room, monitoring the safety valves and manually adjusting the cooling flows because the automated actuators had seized. I saved the batch, and the plant manager sent a company-wide email praising my dedication. But under the new management of Vanguard Industrial Group, those accomplishments were dismissed as ancient history. Bradley Croft believed that senior engineering staff were an unnecessary overhead cost. He convinced the Chief Executive Officer, Julian Drake, that all manual safety checks and operator intervention could be replaced by cloud-based automation. Bradley had spent his short career in air-conditioned boardrooms, building beautiful spreadsheets that showed theoretical efficiency gains. But he had never walked the muddy process lines or felt the heat radiating from a high-pressure steam pipe. He did not know that Reactor 4 had a persistent calibration drift that caused the digital sensors to read 22 pounds per square inch higher than the actual pressure whenever the summer heat exceeded 88 degrees. He did not know that the old cooling water line had a critical resonance frequency that would cause control valves to vibrate loose if the flow rate went too high. He did not know these details because he never talked to the senior operators or the maintenance crews. To him, the plant was just a collection of data points on a screen. In the months before my departure, Vanguard Industrial Group had begun laying off experienced personnel to reduce operating costs. They laid off 24 of our most senior plant operators and mechanics without giving them the legally required 60 days of notice under the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. I had written a detailed warning to Julian Drake, explaining that these layoffs violated the Federal Warning Act and created an unacceptable safety hazard. My warnings were ignored, so I kept copies of the memos. I knew that by laying off these veteran technicians, the company was losing the vital human buffer that stood between normal operations and a catastrophic system failure. The new contract workers they hired did not know the plant's layout, and they certainly did not understand how to react when an alarm went off. When I finally walked out of the Human Resources office at 11:15, I knew the plant was vulnerable. I went to the control room to collect my tools and saw my friend Paul Sullivan sitting at the control console. He looked exhausted and asked if I was really leaving. I confirmed that I had resigned and that my security access was being terminated. Paul looked terrified, knowing that the hot weather was coming and the systems were already unstable. I told him to stay safe and follow the written procedures, but I knew that without my direct support, the corporate managers were going to face a reality check they could not ignore. I was sitting in my truck in the employee parking lot at 11:55, letting the engine run, when my cell phone vibrated with an emergency alert. The automated plant notification system was supposed to have removed my personal number, but the database update was delayed. The text message indicated that Reactor 4 was experiencing a Level 3 process alarm with a critical pressure deviation. I looked at the screen and felt a familiar knot in my stomach. Reactor 4 was the core of the entire production line, operating under extreme pressure. It had a well-documented mechanical issue where the pressure relief valve would stick whenever the internal pressure reached 1,150 pounds per square inch. Additionally, the electronic transmitter was known to report readings 22 pounds per square inch higher than actual levels when the outside temperature rose. Today, the summer sun had pushed the temperature to 94 degrees. To an inexperienced engineer like Bradley Croft, the digital screen would show a catastrophic pressure spike, suggesting the reactor was on the verge of failing. In reality, the vessel was operating safely, and the solution was simply to verify the manual gauge and adjust the cooling water. But that required walking out to the hot reactor deck. While I was analyzing the situation, my phone buzzed with a message from Paul Sullivan. He told me that Reactor 4 was spiking and that Bradley Croft was panicking. Bradley was preparing to bypass the safety interlocks from the computer console in order to keep the line running and avoid a production shutdown. Overriding a safety interlock without physical inspection was a direct violation of safety protocols. If the valve was actually stuck, a manual bypass could lead to a major explosion. It was a clear demonstration of how little they understood the gravity of the safety systems they were disrupting. To them, the physical plant was just a video game where they could bypass rules without any real-world consequences. I texted Paul back, reminding him that I was no longer employed by the company and that he must follow the emergency manual. A moment later, Paul sent me a picture that shocked me. It was a photo of the physical change authorization form required for safety overrides. On the line designated for the senior control engineer's signature, someone had signed my initials. Bradley Croft had forged my initials on the form to authorize the override, hoping to shift the blame to me if something went wrong. I had a sudden flash of memory when I saw the forged signature. I recalled all the safety training sessions I had conducted, emphasizing the absolute ethical and legal responsibilities of signing safety documents. I remembered how Bradley had sat at the back of the room, looking bored, and how he had even made a sarcastic comment about paperwork holding back progress. I realized that Bradley's incompetence had crossed into criminal behavior. In the state of California, forging a signature on a safety-critical document is a serious violation of California Penal Code. Section 470, a felony offense. I immediately saved the photo and emailed it to my personal account as evidence. I knew that this document would be my ultimate shield and sword in the coming days. At 12:15, my phone rang. It was Howard Albright, the chief financial officer. He was breathing heavily and sounded desperate. He told me that Reactor 4 was in crisis and that they needed me to come back to the control room immediately. He offered to pay me double my daily salary if I would just return and resolve the issue. He tried to appeal to my sense of loyalty, asking me to think of the operators who were on shift. I stopped him right there. I reminded him that the company had shown no loyalty to the 24 operators they had fired without warning or notice. I told him that they had violated the Federal Warning Act, and their disregard for their employees was the reason they were in this mess. He tried to argue that the legal department was still reviewing the layoffs, but I shut him down, saying that a federal lawsuit was inevitable. I refused, telling him that my security clearance had been terminated and that I was no longer an employee. Howard pleaded, stating that a complete shutdown of the main line would cost the company $300,000 per day in lost output. He also mentioned that the batch of specialized polymer inside the reactor was worth $1,100,000 and would be ruined if the cooling sequence was not restarted immediately. I told him the solution was detailed in Emergency Procedure EP5, which I had written. Howard was silent for a moment before admitting they could find the file in the database. I knew why. Bradley had deleted my procedures to replace them with his own digital models. I warned Howard that Bradley was attempting to bypass the safety interlocks and had forged my signature to do so. I told him that I had photographic proof of the forged authorization form and that my signature had been placed on it after my badge had been deactivated. I advised him to evacuate the reactor building immediately and to call a certified safety engineer, but he continued to plead. I hung up the phone, put my truck in gear, and drove out of the plant gates, leaving the corporate office to deal with the consequences of their arrogance. As I drove down the highway away from the facility, the emergency notification system sent another alert to my phone. It was a level 3 shutdown warning, indicating that the main production line had completely stopped. I knew the batch of polymer was ruined. The material would have begun to crystallize inside the reactor vessel. At 12:30, my phone rang. It was Colleen Briggs, the assistant to the chief executive officer, calling on behalf of Julian Drake. She told me that Julian was in a panic and demanded to speak with me immediately. I told her to put him on. When Julian's voice came through, he was shouting, accusing me of abandoning my duties and threatening to hold me legally responsible for the damaged equipment. I let him finish before speaking. I told him that my resignation was official and that I was no longer an employee. I also informed him that I was aware of the forged signature on the safety bypass form. I explained that Bradley Croft had forged my initials, which was a direct violation of California Penal Code, Section 470. I told him that this forgery was a serious criminal offense and that my lawyer was preparing a formal complaint against the company and Bradley. Julian fell silent. The anger disappeared from his voice, replaced by a cold anxiety. He tried to claim that the signature must have been an administrative misunderstanding or a temporary placeholder. I laughed and told him that forging a licensed engineer's signature on a safety-critical document is never an administrative mistake. It is a crime. I told him I had photographic evidence of the form with the timestamp showing it was signed after my security access had been revoked. I also reminded him of the memo I had submitted regarding the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act violations. I told him that laying off 24 operators without 60 days of notice was a federal violation and that the board of directors would be very interested to know why he had ignored my warnings. Julian's tone became desperate. He asked what it would take to get me back as a consultant. I told him that I had already accepted a position with Alliance Chemical, which paid 55% more than my previous salary and actually valued my technical expertise. However, I said I could consult through my new employer at our emergency response rate. I told him our rate was $500 per hour, with a 60-hour minimum, which would cost him $30,000 just for me to look at the system. I also stated that I would not touch any equipment until their insurance company had signed off on a full safety assessment. Julian complained that the cost was excessive, but I replied that expertise is expensive when you do not have it in-house anymore. I hung up and drove home. When I arrived, my wife Sarah was waiting for me. She poured me a glass of cold iced tea and sat down with me at the kitchen table. I told her everything, from the resignation to the reactor shutdown and the forged signature. Sarah was shocked by Bradley's actions, but supported my decision. She pointed out that for the first time in years, I did not look stressed or carry the weight of the entire plant on my shoulders. We talked about Emily's upcoming semester at Purdue and realized that we would be able to pay her tuition without any financial strain. He tried to play on my sympathy, saying that the operators would be the ones to suffer if the plant had to shut down, but I knew he was only worried about his own bonus and the board's reaction to his failure. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, it was Audrey Finch, a member of the board of directors at Vanguard Industrial Group. She was a practical, no-nonsense executive who had visited the plant during a safety audit. She told me she wanted to understand the situation from my perspective, as she had received conflicting reports from Julian Drake. I spent the next 45 minutes explaining the entire story. I told her about the lack of compensation adjustment, the 75% pay gap between me and Bradley Croft, and the disregard for safety protocols. I explained the mechanical quirks of Reactor 4 and how Bradley's attempt to override the safety interlocks had caused the shutdown. Most importantly, I told her about the forged signature on the change authorization form and the violation of the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act regarding the recent layoffs. I explained that the lack of proper notice under the Warning Act had left the plant short-staffed during a major crisis, which directly contributed to the severity of the incident. I told her that the board was facing not just a massive financial loss, but also potential criminal charges for forgery and a federal lawsuit for labor violations. Audrey listened quietly, expressing her deep concern about Julian's reckless management. She mentioned that Vanguard took its fiduciary duties very seriously and could not tolerate any legal or safety violations that would damage their fund's reputation. She asked if I had proof of the forgery and the safety memos. I told her I had everything documented and would be happy to share the files with the board's legal counsel. She thanked me for my honesty and told me she would be in touch. The board of directors acted quickly after my conversation with Audrey Finch. An internal investigation was launched the very next morning, and the details that emerged were devastating for the plant's leadership. It turned out that Bradley Croft's desperate attempt to override the safety interlocks had caused a massive pressure spike that damaged two main control valves and corrupted the reactor's calibration database. The physical repair costs alone were estimated at $250,000, but the real damage was the downtime. Because the safety systems had been improperly bypassed, the State Safety Board and the Environmental Protection Agency stepped in, requiring a full safety recertification before the reactor could be restarted. The plant was offline for 4 weeks. The total production loss was calculated at $3,800,000. To make matters worse, the aerospace client who was waiting for the polymer canceled their contract and moved their business to one of Vertex Manufacturing's competitors. The legal consequences were swift. Bradley Croft was immediately terminated and was placed under investigation for forgery under California Penal Code. Section 470. Linda Bennett from Human Resources and CEO Julian Drake were also removed from their positions after the board discovered they had actively ignored the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act violations and the forged documents. The board was forced to pay significant fines for the illegal layoffs, and they realized that their cost-cutting measures had cost them millions. A few weeks later, Audrey Finch called me with an update. She told me that the board had implemented a series of major reforms. They were establishing a new technical fellow track that would compensate experienced engineers based on their expertise rather than their administrative titles. They were also auditing 35 other safety-critical procedures to ensure they were properly documented and approved by the operations team. The total cost of the incident, including repairs, fines, and lost production, had reached $6,100,000. Audrey offered me a position as the Senior Technical Fellow for Process Safety, with a salary that was double what I had been making before. I thanked her for the offer, but told her that I was very happy at Alliance Chemical. They had treated me with respect and paid me a fair market wage. However, I agreed to take on the broader consulting contract to help them rebuild their safety procedures. The contract was worth $120,000, which was more than enough to cover Emily's tuition at Purdue University without us having to take out a second mortgage. Over the next 6 months, I worked with the team at Vertex during my weekends. We established a new protocol for emergency safety overrides, which the operators began calling the Thorn Protocol. It required that any modification to a safety interlock be physically verified by a senior engineer and approved by the plant manager. It was a long process, but it was necessary to rebuild the safety culture that the private equity firm had destroyed. We had to retrain the staff and ensure that the new guidelines were followed without exception. 2 years later, I ran into Paul Sullivan at an engineering conference. He had been promoted to the plant engineering manager under the new technical track, receiving a 60% salary increase. He told me that the plant was running safer and more efficiently than ever before. He also shared a piece of news that made me smile. Bradley Croft had recently applied for an entry-level operator position at the plant. He had been unable to find another management role after the scandal and was looking for a way to rebuild his career. Paul told him that he could have the job if he was willing to start at the bottom and learn how the systems actually worked from the operators. Bradley accepted, and he was currently working the night shift, learning the hard way about the reality of chemical manufacturing. As I drove home that evening, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. My daughter Emily was doing exceptionally well in her studies at Purdue, and my wife Sarah was healthy and happy. Emily had called the night before to tell me that her professor had used the Vertex safety case as a primary example of process control integrity in her chemical safety class. She was proud to tell her classmates that the Thorn Protocol was named after her father. The revenge I had achieved was not through anger or sabotage. It was simply by walking away and letting my absence demonstrate the true value of my expertise. The corporate world often forgets that the people who keep the machines running are the most valuable assets a company has. Sometimes, they have to learn that lesson the hard way, and the cost of that education is always higher than the cost of fair compensation. In the end, competence always speaks louder than credentials. The real victory was not just about the money or the career advancement. It was the satisfaction of knowing that the industry was becoming a little safer and that future engineers would be respected for their practical knowledge rather than just their academic pedigree.